The sun was slowly falling behind the Arizona hills, painting the desert sky in colors of fire and gold. The air was dry, and a faint wind carried the smell of dust and horses. On the edge of that endless land stood an old wooden ranch, its fences broken in places, its paint faded by years of sun and loneliness. Inside lived Eli Carson, a man who had worked the land for over 20 years but had grown used to hearing only the sound of the wind and his cattle. Eli had once been full of life. He came to Arizona after the war, chasing dreams of freedom and open land. He built his ranch with his own hands and married a kind woman named Clara, who brought warmth into the lonely plains. But Clara had passed away during a hard winter 10 years ago, and since then the ranch had turned into a quiet, forgotten place. Eli still worked hard, feeding the animals, fixing the fences, and watching the sky at sunset, but deep inside, he felt hollow, like the desert had taken something from his heart that he could never get back. That evening, as Eli gathered the last bales of hay, he noticed dark clouds moving across the horizon. The sky changed fast. The wind picked up speed and the temperature dropped sharply. Within minutes, a sandstorm rolled through the valley like a giant wall of dust. The horses inside the barn started to cry out, their nerves on edge. Eli ran to close the barn doors, pulling them tight against the roaring wind. Inside the dim barn, the lantern light flickered, casting long shadows across the ground. Eli sat near the stalls, listening to the storm howl outside. The noise was wild, like the desert was angry. Suddenly, through the roar of wind came something else, a knock. It was slow but strong. 3 heavy knocks against the outer barn door. Eli froze. Nobody visited during a sandstorm, not this far out in the desert. He thought maybe the wind was playing tricks, but then the knocks came again, louder this time. He stood, grabbed his lantern, and made his way toward the big wooden doors. As he pulled one open slightly, the wind slammed sand into his face, forcing him to squint. Through the dust and darkness, he saw a tall figure on horseback, wrapped in animal skins and wearing an old feathered headdress. Behind him stood 3 large shapes, their outlines barely visible through the storm. The man dismounted slowly and stepped closer. Eli recognized him. It was Chief Nahale, the Apache leader whose horse Eli had rescued months ago after finding it wandering weak and wounded near the stream. Eli had treated the animal, given it shelter, and returned it safely to the chief. They hadn't spoken since. Now here he was, appearing like a ghost from the desert. Eli shouted over the wind, "Chief Nahale, what brings you here in this weather?" The chief stood tall, his long braids whipping in the storm, his eyes deep and calm even against the wild sand. He raised his hand slightly, and the 3 figures stepped forward. When they came into the lantern's light, Eli blinked in surprise. They were 3 young women, their skin bronze from the sun, their hair long and dark. They were strong and tall, each one nearly as tall as Eli himself. Their presence filled the doorway like a solid wall of quiet strength. The chief's deep voice carried through the storm. "You saved my life," he said simply. His English was careful, measured. "You saved my horse. You showed honor." He looked at the 3 women, then back at Eli. "These are my daughters. They will stay here." Eli frowned, confused. "Stay here? What do you mean?" "The storm will pass. They can rest for the night." The chief shook his head firmly. "No, they stay with you. You are going to be their husband." Eli's heart stopped. The wind seemed to go silent for a moment, even though it still screamed outside. He couldn't believe what he'd just heard. "Their husband?" "Chief, I don't understand." The chief looked straight into Eli's eyes, his gaze heavy but not unkind. "A man who saves life becomes part of our story. My daughters need safety. You live alone. You are good man. Strong heart, no lies." Eli opened his mouth to speak, but the chief had already stepped back. The 3 women bowed their heads slightly, saying nothing. Eli tried again. "Chief, I can't this isn't right. I didn't ask for this." The chief raised one hand, stopping him. "The earth decides what is right. You will learn. Take care of them. They will take care of you." And with that, he turned, mounted his horse, and disappeared into the storm. Eli stood there, his lantern shaking in his hand, staring at the door long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded. The 3 women stood silently in the barn, their faces calm but unreadable. They didn't move until Eli finally stepped aside and gestured toward the hayloft. "You can stay up there," he said awkwardly. "It's dry and warm." The women nodded. The tallest one, the one who seemed to lead the others, looked at Eli and said softly in broken English, "We stay." Father say so. Then she turned and climbed the ladder, her two sisters following her. Eli closed the barn door tightly against the wind and sat down on a bale of hay, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His mind raced. He had spent years alone, and now, without warning, 3 strangers, 3 women, had been left in his care. And the words of the Apache chief echoed again in his ears. "You're going to be their husband." He didn't sleep that night. The storm raged until dawn, shaking the walls and roof, but inside the barn something strange happened. The horses that had been restless earlier grew calm. The air felt different, peaceful, as if the land itself had quieted. When morning came, the storm was gone. The desert lay still under a soft golden light. The air was cool and fresh after the chaos of the night. Eli stepped outside and saw that the storm had swept away the top layer of sand, uncovering smooth stone and even the edges of an old wagon wheel buried years ago. The world looked renewed somehow. He turned toward the barn. Smoke rose from the chimney and he smelled something unexpected. Corn cakes cooking. Inside, the 3 women were awake, working quietly. One was feeding the horses, another was sweeping, and the third was cooking near the small stove. They didn't look like guests. They looked like they belonged. Eli hesitated at the door. The tall woman looked up and met his eyes. "You eat," she said gently, pointing to the small plate on the table. Eli nodded slowly, unsure what to do. He sat, tasted the food, and felt warmth spread through his chest. It had been years since someone had cooked for him, years since anyone had spoken to him in that tone, calm, kind, and human. He didn't know what the coming days would bring, but one thing was certain. The desert had sent him something strange, something powerful, and as he looked at the 3 women moving quietly around his barn, he had a feeling that his life, his quiet, empty life, had just changed forever. That night, as the stars returned to the sky and the silence of the desert wrapped around the ranch again, Eli sat on his porch staring at the horizon. Somewhere out there, the Apache chief was riding home, believing he had given his daughter's safety and Eli a new purpose. Eli whispered softly to himself, almost smiling, "You're going to be their husband." He shook his head and chuckled quietly. "What on earth have you done, old man?" But deep inside, a spark of life flickered, a feeling he hadn't known in years. It was not fear. It was the beginning of something he couldn't yet understand, something that would test his heart, his patience, and the meaning of family itself. The sun rose slowly over the desert hills, spreading soft gold light across Eli Carson's lonely ranch. After the sandstorm, the land looked new, washed clean, almost peaceful. The barn roof had survived, the fences stood tall again, and everything smelled fresh. But inside Eli's mind, things were far from peaceful. He stood near the corral, holding his hat low against the morning sun, watching the 3 Apache sisters as they moved quietly around the yard. They worked without being told what to do, feeding the horses, sweeping the porch, and carrying buckets of water as if they had done this all their lives. Eli rubbed his tired eyes, still unsure what to think. The chief had left them here without warning. He didn't know what kind of promise he was supposed to keep. Were they his guests, his helpers, or something more? He didn't even know how long they planned to stay. When the eldest, Naya, noticed him watching, she gave a polite nod but said nothing. She had calm eyes and a strong face that looked like it had seen both hardship and pride. Her 2 younger sisters, Tala and Winona, followed her lead, quiet but steady. They didn't seem afraid. If anything, they acted as though they belonged here. Eli took a deep breath and approached them. "You ladies, you don't have to do all this," he said awkwardly. "This ain't your job." Naya paused, then smiled faintly. "Work keeps heart good," she replied in slow English. "Father say we help. We keep home clean. You feed horses. We feed you." Eli couldn't help but chuckle softly. "Well, I guess that's fair," he said. That morning was the first time the ranch felt alive in years. The sisters moved with rhythm and purpose, and Eli found himself strangely comforted by the sound of their footsteps and voices. Even the animals seemed calmer. His old dog Rusty followed them happily, wagging his tail. After breakfast, Eli saddled his horse to check the far fence. The sisters followed him out to the edge of the property. The land stretched wide, endless, with mountains in the distance and a riverbed running dry through the valley. Tala pointed toward the hills and said something in Apache. Eli didn't understand, but Winona translated softly. She say, "Storm came from there. Spirits angry. Now calm." Eli nodded, trying to hide his curiosity. There was something peaceful about the way they saw the world, not in terms of land or money, but as something living and sacred. Days passed quietly. The sisters worked from sunrise to sunset, repairing broken rails, washing clothes, and cooking meals that reminded Eli of simpler times. Every evening they sat near the fire in silence or hummed songs in their language. Eli often listened from the porch, watching the stars, feeling a strange warmth grow inside him. One night, as the sky glowed with 1,000,000 stars, Eli finally gathered the courage to ask what had been bothering him. "Why did your father say those words?" he asked gently. "Why did he tell me I'd be your husband?" The firelight flickered on their faces. Naya looked at her sisters, then turned toward Eli. Her voice was calm but firm. "Father say you are good man. Alone too long. We alone too. He say man must protect, woman must bring life. Together make new home. Not about paper or church. About spirit." Eli swallowed hard. He had not expected that answer. He looked down at his rough hands, then back at her. "I don't know if I'm that kind of man anymore," he admitted softly. Naya's eyes softened. "You are," she said simply. "We see." The days turned into weeks, and the routine continued. The townspeople, however, began to notice the change. The old ranch, once nearly abandoned, was now busy and alive. Smoke rose from its chimney every morning. The fences were fixed, the fields green again. When Eli rode into town for supplies, the men at the general store stared and whispered. "Heard he's got Indians living with him," one muttered. Another laughed. 3 of them, too. Must be quite a sight. Eli kept his calm, ignoring the comments. He wasn't about to explain anything he didn't understand himself. But he knew how people could be, quick to judge, slow to understand. When he returned home that afternoon, Tala noticed his tense shoulders. "Men in town?" "Not kind?" she asked softly. Eli nodded. "They talk too much," he said. "Don't worry about them." Tala smiled faintly and said, "Desert not care what people say. Only care who stays strong." Her words stayed with him the rest of the night. As time went on, the bond between them grew in small ways. Winona would hum while she cooked, and Eli found himself tapping his boot along. Naya started teaching him a few Apache words, and he taught her how to mend saddles. Tala helped him round up cattle, her strength surprising even him. One morning, Eli noticed something he hadn't seen in years, the ranch gate painted bright red. The sisters had done it together, saying red was the color of strong heart. The barn had been cleaned, the porch repaired, and wildflowers planted near the front steps. The ranch no longer looked lonely. It looked alive. Eli often caught himself smiling for no reason. The air felt lighter. The silence that once haunted the nights now carried laughter and music. The sisters had not only brought life to his home, they had brought it back to him. But one afternoon, trouble came. While Eli was away at the trading post, a group of men from town rode to the ranch. They claimed they wanted to see the Indian women for themselves. The sisters were working in the corral when the riders arrived, shouting rude jokes and laughing. Naya stood tall, calm but alert. She told her sisters to go inside. The men laughed harder when she didn't answer them. One of them dismounted, trying to walk closer. But before he could take another step, Eli's dog Rusty barked fiercely, warning him back. The man cursed and backed away. When Eli returned home at dusk, he found the sisters quiet and shaken. Naya told him what happened. His face grew hard with anger. "They came here? On my land?" he said through clenched teeth. Naya nodded. "But we safe. Dog protect. Spirits protect too." Eli took his rifle from the wall and checked the bullets. "Next time they come," he said in a low voice, "and they'll wish they hadn't." That night the fire burned low and nobody spoke much. The bond between them had deepened through that moment of danger. Eli understood then that he wasn't just helping them. They were helping him find his strength again. As the next days passed, things slowly returned to normal. The town gossip quieted and word spread that Eli's ranch had become one of the best kept in the region. Travelers who passed by often stopped to buy supplies or rest their horses, and they always spoke of the strange peace they felt there. Eli sometimes caught himself thinking about the Apache chief's words again. Maybe this was destiny, or maybe it was just life giving him a second chance. Whatever it was, it felt right. One evening while they sat near the fire, Naya looked at him and said softly, "Father say you heart like mountain, Quiet but strong. We see now. You not alone anymore. Eli smiled gently, his eyes shining in the flickering light. No, he said. I guess I'm not. As the night deepened, the sisters began to hum their soft song again, a tune that rose and fell like the wind across the plains. Eli leaned back in his chair, listening to the music, feeling the warmth of the fire and the comfort of human presence. He realized something simple but powerful. Life had brought him a gift in the strangest way. The ranch that had once echoed with loneliness now carried the sound of laughter, footsteps, and hope. Outside, the stars glimmered above the desert sky, and the gentle breeze whispered through the open fields. Eli looked toward the horizon and thought about the chief's words once more, words that had confused him at first, but now carried meaning he was beginning to understand. You're going to be there. Husband? The chief had said. Maybe it wasn't about marriage, in the way people thought. Maybe it was about trust, care, and respect. Maybe the chief had known that Eli's heart needed a reason to live again. As he sat there under the wide Arizona sky, Eli finally smiled to himself. The storm had brought more than wind and dust that night. It had brought family, purpose, and the slow return of joy he thought he'd lost forever. The days rolled on, one blending into another under the wide Arizona sky. The ranch that had once been quiet and empty was now full of life and rhythm. Every morning, Eli woke to the smell of firewood and corn cakes, to the sound of the sisters' soft voices and laughter. The air carried peace, something he hadn't known in years. The eldest sister, Naya, had naturally taken charge of most things. She was calm, wise, and always thinking 2 steps ahead. Tala, the middle sister, had the strength of a man and could lift bales of hay as if they were nothing. She loved the animals and worked beside Eli in the fields. Winona, the youngest, had a bright spirit. She often sang while cooking or planting seeds. Together they made the ranch feel whole again. Eli found himself working harder than ever, not out of duty but because it felt good to have a reason to. Every day he discovered something new about the sisters. The way Naya could calm a wild horse with only her hand, how Tala could sense the weather before it came, and how Winona could make a home out of anything, even the coldest room. Still, the outside world was not as kind. The town nearby had started to whisper more loudly now. News traveled fast and people were always curious about what they didn't understand. 3 Apache women living with a white rancher, one shopkeeper said with a smirk. That ain't natural. Others said worse, mocking Eli behind his back. They called him names, said he'd lost his mind or that he was cursed. Eli tried not to care, but every time he went to town, he could feel the stairs follow him like shadows. One Saturday, he rode in for supplies. The moment he walked into the general store, the room fell quiet. Old Mr. Hollis, the storekeeper, greeted him politely, but the men sitting by the counter didn't hide their grins. Hey, Carson, one of them called out. Heard you've got yourself quite the household. 3 wives, huh? The men laughed. Eli's jaw tightened. He picked up his flour and coffee without answering. Another man, younger and meaner, added, You sure they're not holding you hostage out there? Eli turned slowly, his voice calm but steady. I'm holding my own just fine, he said. And they're not prisoners. They're better people than half the men in this room. The laughter stopped. Eli paid for his things, lifted the sacks easily, and walked out. He didn't look back, but he could feel the heat of their eyes on him all the way to his horse. When he returned to the ranch that evening, he found the sisters waiting for him near the barn. Naya could tell from his face that something was wrong. Men talk again? She asked gently. Eli sighed. Yeah, seems like they got nothing better to do. She nodded slowly. People fear what they don't know. Her words stayed with him that night. As the fire crackled, he thought about how right she was. The world wasn't kind to those who lived differently, but maybe, he thought, that was why the chief had chosen him, to prove that different didn't mean wrong. 1 week later, the trouble returned, louder this time. A few of the same men from town rode out to the ranch. Eli saw them coming before they reached the gate. He set down his tools and walked forward slowly. Afternoon, boys, he said evenly. The lead rider, a tall man named Cole Tanner, sneered. Afternoon, Carson. We just thought we'd come check on you. Folks are worried you've gone soft out here. Eli's hand rested on his belt, not near his gun, but close enough. You came all this way to gossip? Cole spat into the dust. We came to see those Indians you've been keeping. Can't have that kind of thing spreading around. Makes the town look bad. Eli's voice stayed calm, but his eyes were hard. They're under my roof. They're my responsibility. You got a problem with that? Cole grinned. Guess we do. He took a step forward, but before he could say another word, a deep growl came from behind Eli. Rusty, the old dog, stood at the porch steps, his fur raised, teeth bared. Behind him appeared Tala, carrying a wooden handle from a broken shovel. Her tall frame blocked the doorway like a wall. Cole froze, realizing he wasn't welcome. Eli took one step closer. You've seen enough, he said firmly. Now get off my land. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Cole smirked, spat again, and turned his horse. You'll regret this, Carson, he said over his shoulder. You're choosing the wrong side. They rode away, leaving dust and tension behind. That night, the ranch was quiet. The stars were bright, but no one sat outside. Eli stayed near the fire, lost in thought. After some time, Naya spoke softly. You protect us, like Father say you would. Eli shook his head. You shouldn't have to be protected from anyone. You belong here as much as I do. Naya smiled faintly. Still, we thank you. You stand tall. Like mountain? Her words made him look up. There was something in her eyes, respect, not pity. He realized then that this was what true family meant. Standing together no matter what others said. Weeks passed and life returned to its rhythm. The sisters brought more ideas to improve the ranch. They taught Eli to plant corn differently, to dig small trenches that caught rainwater. They showed him how to use herbs to heal small wounds. Under their care, even the animals grew stronger. Slowly, the town began to see results. Travelers passing through would stop to trade, telling stories of how Carson Ranch was thriving while others struggled. The same people who had mocked him now watched in silence, realizing maybe there was more to this story than gossip. One afternoon, Eli received a visit from the local sheriff, Tom Greeley, an old friend. The sheriff tied his horse outside and walked up the porch, tipping his hat. Eli, he said, mind if I come in? Sure, Tom, Eli replied. Coffee's hot. Inside, the sheriff sat quietly for a moment, watching Naya pour a cup for him. When she left the room, he leaned forward. You've stirred up a lot of talk, Eli, he said quietly. Some folks don't like what they don't understand. I just want you to know I ain't one of them. But you should be careful, Eli nodded. I appreciate that. But I'm not sending them away, the sheriff smiled faintly. Didn't think you would. You've got more stubborn in you than a mule. Just keep things peaceful, all right? Eli grinned. Always do. When the sheriff left, Naya asked, friend? Yeah, Eli said. A good one. She nodded thoughtfully. Good men rare. Keep him. As summer turned into fall, the ranch entered its most beautiful season. The fields turned golden. The cattle fattened and the air cooled. Eli built a small wooden table outside where they all shared meals at sunset. Laughter filled the evenings. One night, Winona brought out an old drum she had carried from her people's land. She began to beat it softly, and Tala joined with a deep chant that echoed through the valley. The rhythm was slow and strong, like the heart of the earth itself. Eli listened, feeling the sound move through him. It wasn't just music, it was life. He looked around at the glowing fire, at the women who had brought his home back to life, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace mixed with pride. For years, people had said he lived alone, but as he watched them laugh, work, and share stories under the desert sky, he realized something true. He had never been less alone in his life. And though the world outside might never understand what they were building together, Eli didn't need their understanding. The ranch was thriving, the land was healing, and so was he. That night, before turning in, Naya spoke softly from the porch. Father say storms test strong hearts. You pass. Eli smiled at her words, the kind of smile that came from deep inside. Maybe the storm wasn't just out there in the desert, he said. Maybe it was inside me too. And maybe it's finally over. The wind carried the scent of rain across the valley as the fire burned low. The stars blinked above like old friends watching from a distance. The ranch, once a lonely place of silence, now stood as a home built from kindness, courage, and the strength of 4 souls who chose to stand together against the world. Eli leaned back, looked at the horizon, and whispered to himself, You're going to be their husband. But this time the words didn't sound strange at all. They sounded like truth. The season of harvest came quietly that year. The sun wasn't as sharp, the winds were cooler and the nights longer. Eli Carson's ranch stood like a small green island in the middle of the dry Arizona valley. Where other ranchers had lost cattle and crops, his land thrived, strong, healthy, and full of life. The secret wasn't luck. It was the three Apache sisters. Naya had learned the rhythm of the wind. She knew when the rain would come and when it wouldn't. Tala had taught Eli how to dig small channels that led water from the hills to their crops. And Winona had a way of bringing weak plants back to life with care and patience. Under their guidance, the ranch had turned into something extraordinary. Eli often stood at the edge of his land, leaning on the fence, looking out at what they had built together. The ranch wasn't just a home anymore. It was a sign of what people could do when they respected each other and worked as one. But good fortune has a way of stirring jealousy. Word spread across nearby towns that Eli's ranch was thriving while others suffered from drought. Some said he used Indian tricks. Others said he had made a deal with spirits. The more success the ranch showed, the more rumors grew. One afternoon, a wagon arrived at the front gate. Eli saw two men step out, one wearing a gray suit and holding a book of papers. Behind him was a government agent with a badge. They called themselves inspectors. "Mr. Carson," the agent said, "we've been informed you're sheltering Apache people on your land." Eli crossed his arms. "They're not prisoners. They live here with me. This is their home, too." The agent frowned. "That may be, but according to government law, all Apache citizens must remain within their designated territories. You're breaking regulations by housing them here." Eli's jaw tightened. "You think you can tell me who I can share my land with?" The man in the suit stepped forward. "It's not personal, sir. It's just procedure." Naya, who had been watching from the porch, stepped down slowly. Her calm voice cut through the dry air. "This is our home. We work, we grow, we hurt no one." The agent didn't even look at her. "Ma'am, you're not permitted to stay outside your tribal boundary." Eli's eyes flashed. "Boundary? You ever seen a line in the dirt that the earth recognizes? This land was theirs before any paper said otherwise." The agent sighed, tired of arguments. "I'll give you 1 week to send them back. After that, we'll return with soldiers." He tipped his hat stiffly and left with his partner, their wagon rumbling down the dusty road. Eli watched them go, his fists clenched at his sides. The sisters stood silently behind him. Tala finally spoke. "You fight for us," Eli turned to her. "You don't belong in a cage called a reservation. You belong where you're free." That night, the ranch house was filled with heavy silence. The sisters didn't sing. The fire didn't seem to burn as bright. Eli couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch listening to the coyotes in the distance, wondering what to do. He wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid for them. Early next morning, he rode into town to see Sheriff Tom Greeley. The sheriff was standing outside the office reading a telegram. When he saw Eli, he nodded. "Heard about your visitors." Eli dismounted. "They gave me a week. Said they'll come back with soldiers if I don't send the sisters away." The sheriff sighed. "I figured as much. Folks up in the capital don't care what's right, they care about control. What can I do, Tom?" Tom looked at him steadily. "You stand your ground. I'll back you as long as I can. You've done nothing wrong, but you need to be ready. They might come looking for a fight." Eli nodded. "I've been ready for fights all my life." The next few days were tense. The sisters worked quietly, but their eyes showed worry. They didn't fear death. They feared losing their home. Eli noticed how often Naya looked toward the horizon as if waiting for something. On the 5th day, she spoke. "Father will come," she said. Eli raised a brow. "The chief?" She nodded. "He will not let us be taken." Sure enough, on the 7th morning, before the sun was fully up, they heard the sound of distant hoofbeats. Eli stepped out and saw a group of Apache riders approaching, led by Chief Nahali himself. His long hair had streaks of gray now, and his face was marked by time and wisdom. The chief dismounted, walked to Eli, and clasped his arm. "You kept them safe," he said. Eli nodded. "I did what was right." The chief's sharp eyes studied the land around them. "You built something good, strong. That is why they fear it." Before Eli could reply, dust rose on the horizon again, from the other direction. The government wagon was returning, this time with 4 soldiers riding beside it. The sheriff arrived moments later, his horse lathered in sweat. "They're early," he said quietly. And they don't look friendly. The two groups met at the edge of Eli's property. The agent dismounted and said coldly, "Mr. Carson, we gave you a week. You chose not to cooperate." Eli stepped forward. "This land belongs to me and everyone on it works honestly. You have no right to take anyone." The agent motioned to the soldiers. "We're enforcing federal law." Chief Nahal stepped between them, tall and proud. "Your law," he said firmly, "is not the law of the earth. You take land, water, and freedom, and still you call it justice." The agent frowned. "Step aside, old man." The sheriff moved his horse closer, his hand near his holster. "Careful," he warned. "No one's breaking the peace here unless you force it." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The soldiers glanced at each other, unsure. The chief stood like a statue, his daughters behind him. Eli's heart pounded, but he didn't step back. Finally, one of the soldiers, a young man barely 20, spoke softly. "Sir, maybe we should just leave it. They're not hurting anyone." The agent glared at him but saw the truth. He was outnumbered, not in weapons but in resolve. The men before him weren't rebels. They were people who stood for something real. After a long silence, he finally said, "You've made your choice, Carson, but this isn't over." He turned his horse sharply and rode away, his men following. The chief watched until they disappeared into the horizon. Then he looked at Eli and nodded. "You are man of honor. My daughters were not given to you as burden. They were given as bridge. Now I see I chose well." Eli didn't know what to say. He simply nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. That evening, as the sky turned crimson, the Apache riders sat with Eli around the fire. They shared food, laughter, and stories of the land. The sheriff joined them, quietly sipping his coffee, knowing he had witnessed something important, something that went beyond law and blood. When the chief rose to leave, he placed a hand on Eli's shoulder. "You are their husband, yes, but not only that. You are their family, their protector, their equal." Eli's voice was soft. "I'll stand by them for as long as I live." The chief nodded once and rode into the night with his men, the rhythmic beat of hooves fading like a heartbeat into the dark desert. That night, the ranch was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, peaceful, powerful, complete. Eli sat on the porch beside Naya, watching the stars. "Your father said something," Eli murmured. "He said I was meant to be your bridge." "What did he mean?" Naya smiled gently. "He mean you walk between two worlds, yours and ours. You understand both. You bring peace." Eli looked up at the sky. "I never thought I'd be that man." "You already are," she said softly. He nodded slowly, his heart full. The wind moved through the valley, whispering through the dry grass, carrying the scent of earth and fire. Somewhere in that stillness, Eli felt the truth. He wasn't just protecting them anymore. They had given him back his purpose, his pride, and the missing half of his soul. The world outside might still be divided, but on this small patch of desert land, 4 hearts had found a way to live as one. Years passed slowly under the Arizona sun. The world beyond the desert kept changing. Towns grew larger. Trains came and new laws were written, but at Eli Carson's ranch, time seemed to move at its own quiet pace. The ranch that had once been an empty patch of dust now stretched green and wide. The fences were strong, the barns freshly painted, and the fields full of crops. But it wasn't just the land that had grown. It was the people who lived upon it. The Apache sisters had become more than Eli's companions. They were his family, his strength and his reason to wake up each day. Together, they had built something that could not be taken away by law, distance, or the prejudice of others. Eli had learned many things from them over the years: how to read the wind, how to listen to the silence, and how to see life not as ownership but as belonging. They had shown him that the land wasn't his to control. It was his to care for. Naya, the eldest, remained the calm center of their home. She guided the family with quiet wisdom and a steady hand. Tala worked side by side with Eli, riding horses, fixing fences, and teaching their children how to handle the land. And Winona, still full of light and song, brought laughter to the home even on the hardest days. Yes, children. By now, there were little ones running around the yard, their skin golden like the desert sun, their hair dark and wild. They laughed in both Apache and English, and their laughter carried far across the valley. People in town who once mocked Eli now nodded when his name was mentioned. They bought cattle from him, traded for his corn, and even came seeking his advice on how to survive the harsh seasons. Time had changed hearts, slowly but surely. One autumn afternoon, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the valley. Eli looked up from his work and saw a small group of riders approaching from the east. His heart recognized the rhythm before his eyes did. It was Chief Nahale. He was older now, his hair nearly white, but his eyes still sharp as ever. The years had not dimmed his spirit. When he dismounted, the children ran to him without fear, surrounding him like he was a legend stepped out of a story. The chief placed his hands gently on their heads and smiled. "Strong blood," he said softly. "Both sides of the river in them." Eli stepped forward, his hat in hand. "It's good to see you again, Chief," the old man nodded. "And you, Carson. I see my daughters live well. You kept your word." "I did what any man should," Eli said humbly. "They gave me more than I ever gave them." The chief's eyes glowed with quiet pride. "You learned what most men never do. That family is not built by blood alone, but by the heart that protects it." They sat together on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky red and gold. The chief spoke of the old days, of battles, loss, and the fading of his people's traditions. "The world forgets," he said sadly. "But maybe here on this land a piece of the old ways still breathes." Eli nodded. "As long as I'm alive, it will. This land remembers every step, every voice that ever touched it." The chief smiled faintly. "Then I can rest easy knowing my daughters chose well." He stayed for 2 days, sharing stories and blessings before finally preparing to return to his people. On the morning of his departure, he looked out over the valley and said softly, "The desert once took much from me, but today, I see it has given something back." Then, before mounting his horse, he turned to Eli and said, "You were never just their husband, Carson. You were the bridge I hoped for, a man strong enough to hold two worlds together." Eli didn't speak. He simply bowed his head in respect as the old chief rode away, his figure fading into the light of dawn. Years rolled by again, one after another. The children grew tall. Some stayed to work the ranch. Others moved toward the towns, carrying both Apache spirit and Carson pride within them. The valley began to change as well. New settlers arrived, roads were built, and the world around them grew louder and faster. Eli aged like an oak tree, strong but weathered by time. His hands grew rougher, his hair turned silver, and his back carried the story of every year he had lived. Yet every morning he still rose before the sun, walked to the corral, and thanked the earth for another day. The sisters aged too, but beautifully. Naya's eyes still held calm strength. Tala's hand still guided the horses with ease, and Winona's song still filled the house with light. One evening, as the air turned cool and the sun dipped low, Eli sat on the porch surrounded by his family. The children and grandchildren were gathered, their laughter mixing with the sound of the wind. He leaned back in his chair, smiling softly. "This old ranch sure looks different now," he said with a quiet chuckle. Naya placed her hand gently on his arm. "Still same," she said. "Only more life now." Eli nodded, his eyes glistening. "You're right. It's more alive than it's ever been." The youngest of the grandchildren, a girl with curious eyes, climbed onto his lap. "Grandpa Eli," she asked innocently, "is it true you were all alone before Great-Grandpa Nahale brought Grandma Naya and her sisters here?" Eli smiled at the memory, his weathered face softening. "That's true," he said. "But I wasn't alone for long. The desert had other plans." The little girl tilted her head. "Did you know they were going to be your wives?" Everyone laughed softly at her innocent question. Eli looked at Naya, whose gentle smile still carried the same quiet mystery as the first night he met her. "No, sweetheart," he said. "I didn't know anything back then, but sometimes life knows what you need before you do." The child thought for a moment, then said, "So the chief was right?" Eli nodded slowly. He was right about everything. That night after the family went inside, Eli stayed on the porch staring out into the quiet desert. The moon rose bright and full, casting silver light over the land. He could hear the distant sound of coyotes and the whisper of the wind moving through the mesquite trees. He closed his eyes and let the memories come. The storm, the knocks on the barn door, the chief's voice saying those strange words, "You're going to be their husband." Back then, it had sounded like a riddle, something impossible, but now after all the years he understood. The chief hadn't meant it as a command. He had meant it as a prophecy of unity, of purpose, of two worlds healing through love and respect. Eli rose slowly and walked out to the edge of the field. The earth beneath his boots was cool and solid. He could feel the heartbeat of the land, the same heartbeat that had carried him through every trial and joy. He whispered softly to the wind, "Thank you, old friend. You gave me more than I ever asked for." From behind him came the soft sound of footsteps. Naya approached quietly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "You still talk to the wind," she said with a gentle laugh. Eli smiled. "It listens better than most people do." She stood beside him, looking out at the glowing horizon. "Father's words still live," she said. "He said storms bring change, not always pain. You were the calm after his storm." Eli reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining. "And you were my peace after mine." They stood together in silence, the moonlight shining over their weathered faces. The years eventually caught up to Eli Carson. When his time came, it came softly, no pain, no fear, just the sound of the morning wind and the warmth of the desert sun. He passed away sitting on that same porch, his hat resting on his knee, his eyes open toward the horizon. The entire valley came to honor him. Settlers, townsfolk, and Apache families alike. The man who had once been mocked for living differently was now remembered as a man who built bridges with kindness. Chief Nahali's grandchildren came too, bringing a small wooden carving shaped like two hands joined together. They placed it on Eli's grave, beside a simple stone that read, "Eli Carson. He chose understanding over fear." Years later, the legend of the lonely rancher who became family to an Apache chief's daughters spread across the region. People told the story not as a tale of romance, but as a story of unity, how one man and three sisters turned an empty land into a home where two worlds met and healed. And when travelers passed through that valley, they often said the wind there felt different, gentler, warmer, as if it carried a whisper of old love and endless peace. If you listened closely, some said you could still hear a soft voice in the wind saying those unforgettable words that started it all. "You're going to be their husband." But now, those words didn't sound strange anymore. They sounded like destiny.